Okay, good morning and good afternoon. This is Josh Haas with the Hawk Migration Association of North America, signing in from Southwest Michigan as always. And again, I'd like to welcome everybody, all of our constituents, anyone who might be new to our Lunch and Learn series. We're excited to have and welcome Mike Stewart with us today. He's got a great talk planned related to greyhawks and the movement of them. So before we get too far ahead and get Mike going, just a few housekeeping items. HMANA does great things and aims to do as much as possible in terms of conserving and partnering in conservation for raptors especially, but also supporting a migration site network. As a reminder, HMANA doesn't own any of the site data that we gather and make available. We rely on all of the migration sites and the great site coordinators that we work with day in and day out, to gather that data and to make that data available and use it in things like the raptor population index. And all of that is made possible through donations from people just like yourself. So consider donating. We have a great support page related to becoming members, making one-time or sustained donations that help us create and programs like this. Just a few more housekeeping items in terms of Zoom and some tips. Just as a reminder, please pop open your chat, which you can find that at the bottom of your Zoom window. Open that chat and engage with us. Tell us where you're dialing in from. And also use the chat to ask any questions that you have of Mike, especially as he goes through his presentation. I will be consolidating those questions and I'll facilitate the Q&A once he's finished with his program. If there's any question that comes up in process where it would be more beneficial for Mike to maybe answer those right away, I can stop him in the program and do that, but most of the time that doesn't happen. Also, in terms of Zoom, if you don't like the view that you see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you should see a little button called View. You can choose that view and update your screen to where it looks the best for you. Lastly, next month, just as a reminder, we're going to have another Lunch and Learn, and we're going to feature Hardy Kern from the American Bird Conservancy. And he's going to talk to us about a big program that they're running related to threats to without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for today, Mike Stewart. And Mike he comes to us having been interested in birds since 2002, when a pair of blue jays nested outside his kitchen window. He spent the past 20 years birding primarily in the eastern U.S., but also Texas. He retired from the Army in 2019. Thank you for your service, Mike. And after that, he attended the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, where he completed an MS in biology studying greyhawks. He has since moved to Athens, Texas, where he is a PhD student currently at Texas A&M University-Kingsville. Mike continues his research with greyhawks and is involved with banding additional raptor species along with songbirds. He lives with his wife, Yvette, and their green-cheeked Conure, Greenlee. In his spare time, he enjoys birding close to home and also participating in 2 banding programs run by the Institute for Bird Populations. So, Mike, thanks for being here, and I'll turn the program over to you.
All right. Thank you, Josh, and thank you for the invitation to talk about greyhawks. I've tried to include a little bit of everything, so hopefully you'll get some of everyone's interest. This is going to be a bit of a mixture of what I found out during my master's research and a little bit about what is still ongoing and what I'm focused on now at Texas A&M Kingsville. So you can see below, my current advisor is Dr. Ashley Tanner. I've been working with Bill Clark throughout this, as well as with Dr. Brian Millsap. And then for the master's research, I was also working with Dr. Brent Bibles and my advisor at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, Dr. Timothy Brush. So, and what I looked at for the master's was home range dynamics of adults and juvenile movements after they disperse from their natal areas. And this thing is not wanting to advance for me. There we go. So a little bit of background information about greyhawks. This is a range map out of the Birds of the World species account showing their distribution. Before I started out on this, there were year-round sightings of greyhawks in the lower Rio Grande Valley. no one knew if the birds were moving around some, if pairs were staying together, anything like that, just that they were seeing them throughout the year. They also occur in portions of West Texas, especially Big Bend and the Davis Mountains. They're in southwestern New Mexico, even though that's not shown on this map, and then southeast Arizona, where the majority of the information about greyhawks comes from. And they're not a very commonly occurring species in the U.S. Their distribution and status is probably not the best understood of some of the raptors that we have. And here in Texas, they've been state listed as threatened since 1977, and they're considered a species of greatest conservation need. So this map is showing the study area. It's Hidalgo County on the west and Cameron County on the east. They are in South Texas. You can see in the inset map down here in the red bordered area in relation to like southeast Arizona and southwestern New Mexico up here in the top left corner. So we are quite a bit farther south than the birds in the rest of the U.S. The light blue on the map is mostly various tracts of the lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge, with the exception of one down here. That's Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge. Those are a lot of the spots where you have native vegetation that's remaining. According to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, 95% of the natural habitat in the valley has been cleared. I've seen some other numbers, but I haven't seen one any lower than 93% was the lowest I've seen. And prior to this, I think people thought the greyhawks were mainly associated with the natural areas along the Rio Grande River, which is the real windy southern border of the study area. There were some sightings in urban areas, but not a whole lot. I think most people, if you come to the valley, a lot of people will go to Benson State Park, D'Angelo Lewis County Park, Santa Ana, maybe down to Sable Palm and Brownsville if they wanted to see greyhawks. So pretty specific areas people go look for them. So I started this in December of 2019. It's when I started trying to capture and color band greyhawks. We've been color banding all the birds that we've captured, and to date, that's about 185. I don't think we've added more since I updated that. Deployed 38 different GPS-GSM transmitters. Some of those have been recovered and redeployed. So 60 birds have been tracked altogether. If you're not familiar with GPS-GSM transmitter, GPS is the global positioning system where it gets fixes from the satellites, and the GSM part is the global system for mobile communications. So it uses the cellular network to transmit the data. This picture here in the bottom left is showing one of the transmitters on the back of the bird. This one has an elevated solar panel to keep it from getting covered up by her feathers, and it'll keep recharging the battery. They obtain fixes, varying time periods, varying time schedules, rather, depending on how the battery's doing. So as long as they're above 75%, most of the transmitters I have out are getting a fix every 30 minutes. I've also deployed 20 VHF transmitters on birds. They've been primarily on adults. There were 3 second-year females that were paired with an adult that we went ahead and put a VHF transmitter on, being pretty confident that they were paired up and in a territory and weren't going to move. And those were mostly used to locate nest, and then another way to help determine whether adults were staying in their territory with their mates year round or not. And then for the master's research, we did a real general classification of land cover types as either urban or natural to try and get a bit of a comparison between the two. So most of the greyhawks we've captured have been road trapping with baluster trees. If you're not familiar with those, the illustration in the bottom middle shows a couple different pictures of a baluster tree. They can be different shapes and sizes. They can have a weight attached to the trap or incorporated into it. And then in the bottom right is a mouse in a baluster tree, and that's how they work. You've got a critter in there, a mouse, maybe a house sparrow or a starling, a non-native species is not protected. but you have something in there the hawk thinks it can get, and they come down and hopefully try and grab it with their talons and then get caught in one of the fishing line nooses that will pull closed around their foot or their toes. Also captured some using a great horned owl lure. It's a taxidermied great horned owl that we put between two mist nets in a V shape. And during the nesting season, that's pretty effective. They have a lot of incentive to try and drive the owl away. And when they make a pass at it, hopefully they hit the net and get caught. And then also climbing trees, as long as the trees look pretty sturdy and not too terribly high, because I'm not very fond of heights. I've been able to go up and get the nestlings and lure them to the ground where people ban them on the ground, where it'll be much safer than me trying to mess with them up in a tree. And then we bring them back up and put them in the nest when we're done. So anyone not familiar with banding, got some pictures in here showing what all we do. The top left is putting the band on the bird. These are different from the butt-in songbird bands. They have a lock-on tab. So you use just a regular pair of slip joint pliers to fold this tab over, making the bands much harder for the hawk to remove. And then going from left to right, this is putting on one of the aluminum color bands. They have two holes in a flange, and you put a pop rivet through them to attach those. And then measuring the tail, got a ruler between the central rectrices, measuring the longest tail feather. And in the bottom right is measuring the halix claw, so the rear facing toe. And all these are done. This is the white thing, that's a cardboard shipping tube. So I can do all that while the hawk is in there, have different sizes depending on the size of hawk that you capture. And this keeps them pretty calm. It also makes it much easier to handle them and be messing around close to their talons without them grabbing you. And then before taking them out of the tube, on the left side there, I've got the hawk in the tube on a scale to get its weight. In the middle, measuring the wing cord. So I've got my fingers underneath the wing, holding it just above the ruler, so I'm not flattening it out. I'm not getting a flattened wing measurement. And then after the wing cord, measure the culmen from the cere, so the beak from the yellow kind of fleshy part. And all those measurements help sex the birds. You know, male gray hawk is just as gray as a female gray hawk, and without these measurements, we can't really separate them. But with them, with the weight alone, there's no overlap between the larger females and the smaller males. So once we have them, we can also age them sometimes a bit more specifically than just juvenile or adult. And then the codes on here, if you're not familiar with those, it's a calendar-based aging system for banding. So HY/SY is hatching year or second year, depending on whether it's before December 31st or after January 1st. So that's a bird in juvenile plumage. The bottom left is a bird that is showing some preformative molt that you can see here on the kind of side of her nape. It's got some gray feathers coming in. It's also a good shot of the pretty big beak that they have for their size. A nice bright yellow cere. And then on the right is a second year going through her second pre-basic molt, getting adult plumage for the first time. So birds like that are pretty easy to age. Once they're done with that second pre-basic molt, they'll look like the bird up here in the top left, where they're in after hatching year, after second year, again, depending on the time of the year. And then the picture below that is showing a bird replacing adult feathers with more adult feathers. So as long as they do a complete molt, which they often do, you can't age them any more specifically than that. The top right, you can see a bird, the arrow is pointing to two retained juvenile feathers on its rump. So you know that the bird is in its adult plumage for the first time and still has some retained juvenile feathers, and we can age those more specifically. And in the bottom right, the arrow is pointing to a retained adult feather, again, helping to age the bird a little bit more specifically. We know that that one has been in its adult plumage at least once prior to that. So, and then with the color bands, we can age them very specifically. The bottom left shows a male with his black color band. The females were getting orange color bands, and this female didn't have one there, but I was able to capture her later on in that summer. So now she has one as well. And they were on a palm snag in Harlingen in one of the residential neighborhoods. So this map is showing where we've banded greyhawks throughout the valley. It doesn't look like 185, but there's some of them. This is Harlingen over here where the red cursor should be going around it. And so you can see there's a cluster of them right here where a lot of them are overlapping. And then even with some of those, one of those points is going to have several underneath it, because it would be one of the two adults was banded and then 2 or 3 nestlings were banded. So a lot of them are stacked on top of each other. And we've tried to spread them out a lot. We haven't gone and tried to focus on any particular area in the valley or try and focus on males or females, anything like that. We've tried to go and find greyhawks wherever we can and catch every one that we find. And sometimes they cooperate and oftentimes they don't. So some of the birds, like I said, are getting these GPS-GSM transmitters, and they wear them with a backpack type harness. So the harness is pictured on the left side. This was a tubular Teflon ribbon that's commonly used. Part of the reason why some of these transmitters have been redeployed is I found out very early on that as quick as I was trying to get these deployed, greyhawks started chewing through this and chewing them off. So we had to make quite a few adjustments. One of them was switching to a different harness material called Spectra that have only had one greyhawk chew through. But they apparently didn't like them. They wouldn't leave them alone, and they just went right through these things. But the harness has 2 loops. Each wing goes through a loop, and then you can see in the picture in the middle on the bottom, they wear it right there on their back like a backpack. And in that photo, I'm checking the fit, trying to make sure that it's not too tight. So if they gain or lose a little bit of weight, it won't negatively affect them there. And then also not so loose that it'll impact their flight. And then after we get it fit properly, try and preen it under the feathers as much as possible and check the fit. Then the excess material we cut off after I've tied knots, and then super glue the knots. I've also started sewing through the knots. I think that a lot of them probably turned around, and the very top knot is probably what they started working on first when they were getting these off. So a bit of reinforcement to try and keep these on them. So once we got those, I've got this bad spot. Okay. So initially for the master's project, we had 15 VHF transmitters out. We got 5 later on, but for the master's, we had 15. We didn't try and really target sexes and ended up with 4 males and 11 females. So not as balanced as I would have hoped, but those initial 15 were on just adults. The 3 second-year birds were in the later VHF transmitters. And then with the GPS-GSM, we had 16 males and 6 females that were tracked. And of those, there were 3 pairs that had transmitters. One had a GPS-GSM and their mate had a VHF. We did locate 25 nests. They were in 9 different tree species, so they don't seem to have a favorite. There have been a few pairs of greyhawks that have reused the same nest in subsequent years, and the ones that have not, that have re-nested, every single one of them that I've found, their nest of multiple years, they've stuck to the same species of tree, which I thought was pretty interesting. So if we had one nest in a live oak, the next year they picked another live oak. We had one that found a palm snag, one of these Washingtonia palms. It didn't have any fronds coming out of the top, but it still had a bit of a skirt on there to make a nice platform. And the next year they went and they found a different palm snag and used that. So they seem to find something they like and stick to it as far as tree species. And then at the time that I was finishing up the master's project, we had located 50 pairs of greyhawks, and 21 of those were confirmed breeders. And I'm not sure exactly what we're up to now with territories and pairs. I think Bill and I would have to sit down and count our numbers and argue about it a little bit, but we've found quite a few more since then. And so this map is also showing some of the home ranges and where they are. A lot of them, very tiny little orange circle for some of the females. There's a little light blue one for a male next to it. This huge blue one is one that we'll get on the next slide right here. So there were two that were excluded from some of the statistical analyses. This is one of them. They were both males that we suspect were unmated, that were floaters. And so this is what his home range ended up looking like. He did have sort of a core area, this 50% utilization distribution, this light blue thing where he would spend half of his time. But then he would go and make these frequent trips other places. So it ended up with just this really huge, weird home range shape. And a lot of the time when he was going to some of these other places, this dark blue over here, this blue over here, these are other Greyhawk territories that he would go hang around the edge or even right in the middle of their territory for a little bit. So, like I said, he got excluded along with another one. With the VHF transmitters, just about any time we went out to try and track those birds, we could usually go stop right where the bird was caught and be able to detect them with the antenna and receiver. The only one that really gave us any trouble, there was one female by Ansel Lewis County Park, and she spent some time across the river in Mexico. So sometimes we could detect her over there. Sometimes we couldn't pick her up. And then, like I said, we had the three pairs that had a transmitter between them. So what we found during this is the adults don't migrate. The adults were staying in these home ranges throughout the year. The breeding home range is the winter home range. You can go find them any time of year. You could also go in the middle of December, play a Greyhawk call, and if they're anywhere nearby, they would immediately respond and come over to defend their territory. So they're pretty aggressively defending these throughout the year. So this is showing three different methods of calculating home ranges. This is almost 2 years worth of fixes for an adult male. All of his fixes are included on this, and you just see three of the different methods. So in my master's thesis, I ended up calculating all three and comparing them, but really the only useful one for this is the orange one, the Browning Bridge home range. A lot of the fixes are real close together in time and they're autocorrelated. And so two of these methods don't really deal with that. It violates assumptions for it. And so it's not particularly useful, but the red one underneath, the minimum convex polygon, is connecting the dots. So if you tell it you want 95%, it's excluding 5% of the fixes, and it's connecting dots around them, making sure it doesn't exceed 180 degrees. So as long as the angle is 180 or less, it'll connect the dots. The light blue one that's in there is a kernel density estimate. It's fitting a little bit more tightly around the fixes. And then the Browning Bridge home range is also accounting for movement between fixes and time between fixes. So this is just to show three different ways of calculating it. And even within one of the methods, you can, depending on some of the settings in there, you can get varying area, different size of it. So in my mind, I mean, I think it's useful in my mind. I think probably even more useful is having these fixes, seeing exactly where the bird was this whole time. So if you wanted to conserve an area, I would want to conserve everywhere that he went, hopefully not just a smaller section of that. So then we did find that males, males did have larger home ranges than females throughout this. So this is another slide that I threw in here. Forget the bird. Yeah. This is one male in far Texas. He's in a very, very urban area. This is within this is almost 2 years worth of fixes also. He ended up getting hit by a car. His wing was too badly damaged that they couldn't rehabilitate him, and they ended up euthanizing him. But I split this one in between sort of breeding and winter seasons and compared 50% utilization distribution for them. So you can see this one bird throughout these different time periods really didn't change that much. So this is just to illustrate that you go there looking for them in the summer or in the winter, and they're in the same spot using the same area. He had just a huge cluster of fixes where a lot of it was trees behind 3, maybe 4 houses here running kind of north to south. A very small area where he spent most of his time. And right by, this is Sam Houston Boulevard. This is a road that's fairly high traffic, pretty busy throughout the day. So this is a pair in a nest. This is a cedar elm in one of the natural areas. And we would color band the nestlings, but I did not want to try and put transmitters on them. They still have a little bit of filling out to do, especially with muscles. The legs, bone structures as big as they're going to get, but I didn't want to try and figure out how much room I needed to leave for them to grow into. So on the right is one of the birds after it's fledged from the nest. You can see that her tail is still a little bit stubby, but and she'll probably put on a little bit more weight, but she's pretty well full grown at that point. So we were able to trap the fledglings with balsha trees before they left their natal areas and put transmitters on them then. So this is one, I threw a green triangle here on the far left side. This is the nest he came out of, was over here. And then all these fixes are showing where he's spent his time prior to dispersing from the natal area. And this picture was taken during the winter. Found him hanging out in a different area, perched on a power line. You see he's got a fair amount of preformed molt on his nape. And the transmitter is also pretty covered up. I think these feathers are probably sticking up because of the transmitter, but it's hard to say. And when they're flying around, though, it's usually exposed. They usually get charged up fairly well. So he made use of a relatively small area moving around until he left. And then once the juveniles did leave, this map is only showing juvenile fixes as they dispersed. So they wandered all over the place. And the dark gray line, that's the international border, you know, the Rio Grande River. Got Brownsville down here, Harlingen, Mission and McAllen are over here. So this is Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge. Benson State Park is going to be off over here in the far west. So they covered a pretty good area. And I was able to track 14 juveniles with 8 males and 6 females. So this is a boring table. It's published now if you want to look at it in more detail. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on it, but was able for most of them to calculate winter home ranges. There were 3 that quit transmitting prior to that. I think they were probably all killed or died. But 2 of them, I did include their distances in the straight line distance from the nest, just because of where they traveled. So that I calculated winter home ranges for birds when I could, and we also calculated a straight line distance from their natal nest to the center of their winter home range, or in the case of a couple of them, to their last fix. This is showing the 9 juvenile winter territories. There were 2 that did winter down here in Mexico. The orange one, this female, had quite a bit larger area because she was in a spot that was mostly ag fields, and there were some canals running through there with trees along the canal. So she would just move up and down these canals and cover a pretty large area doing that. So that's sort of boring. I want to get to this. This is one of the things I thought was pretty interesting. We had 4 juvenile greyhawks that decided they weren't going to stick around and they wanted to take off. This one with the yellow fixes didn't leave until, I think it was the first, maybe second week in December, and she stopped right about here in Mexico in Tampico. These other 3 traveled down to Central America. So 2 of the males, one went to Nicaragua, one went to Honduras, and they both got down there and then stopped transmitting. And I left the transmitters on for over a year, hoping they were in bad cell coverage and they would eventually move out of the area. But finally turned them off. I think they're dead. And then the orange one's a female that went and spent the winter in El Salvador and then came back. And so those 3 that all went to Central America, they left the same time frame that you would see birds migrating out of Arizona. It was October when they all left. And then, like I said, 2 didn't survive. The female in El Salvador survived, though, and her and the female that wintered in Tampico, Mexico in April, which again coincides with migration timing for Arizona. They turned around and came back to the study area. This is a map showing the female that went and wintered in Tampico. So I think not quite halfway down Mexico. And this is a 50% utilization distribution. So you can see that half of her time was spent here with just a tiny little chunk in this spot. But it's very hard looking at that satellite imagery, even pulling it up on Google Maps and zooming in to find trees. So she wintered in a really, really urban area. And that's 9 out of the 11 that settled in the winter, settled in urban areas. So this is probably my favorite thing from the master's research. This is showing 2 different females that both came out of the same nest. There was a pair of greyhawks in Harlingen that had 2 chicks in the nest. They were both females. We were able to get transmitters on both of them. And in the inset, the yellow fixes, you can see the one female, the blue diamond. This is the nest they came out of in Harlingen. So the one, the yellow fixes, she went over in Hidalgo County a little bit, down to Mexico just a little bit, but she spent most of her time wandering around Cameron County and then wintered in Brownsville. And that's where she still is now. And then her sister is still alive also, and she wandered around Hidalgo County for a bit and then just took off and went to El Salvador and wintered down there. So she ended up returning, and last winter and this winter both, she has just stayed up here in the study area. She did not repeat the trip down to El Salvador. So I'm not sure if that counts as migration or not. It's sure looks like it if you just look at 1 year, but then looking at what she's done since then, it looks like maybe a bit of genetic predisposition to migrate, and then was able to switch that gene off or something. I'm not sure what they're doing, but very, very different behavior out of 2 females that had presumably genes from the same 2 adults, came out of the same nest. So this is something I think is pretty interesting also. So the last slide, that female that went and wintered in El Salvador, this, I guess you could call her little brother from the following year. That next year, the same adult female in Harlingen, they used the same nest in an ash tree in someone's front yard. And this year they had 3 chicks instead of 2. This time, all 3 of them were males. I got a transmitter on one of them, and he went and spent the winter in El Salvador, just like his sister did the year before. So I know that those 2 had the same mother. It's the same adult female that's color banded. The father, I don't know. He's not color banded. So it might be the same male, maybe not. But he did a similar thing also, that he did this his first winter, and then this winter he stayed up here in the study area. He didn't repeat this. So this is kind of a mess. This is showing some of what I'm working on now. The orange circles, I didn't put a legend on here. The orange circles are a bunch of territories that we've identified so far. So we're finding more and more places where there are greyhawks that are, repeated visits. They're defending an area. So we've got a lot of different territories, and some of these down here, this is the Brownsville area down in the southeast. This big clump up here is Harlingen, Texas. If you follow these across here, they're a little south of, you've got Interstate 2 that runs east to west, and then also running east to west is Business 83 that cuts all across here. And that's what a lot of those are along, either a little north or a little south of Business 83. That's also where a lot of people are. So the layer underneath all that, the colored mess, that's a GIS layer of land cover. I'd have to look at the legend, but I would bet that the purple is agricultural fields. And that's what a lot of this area is. So there's a lot of greyhawks along this area, but there's also a lot of places that they could use. You know, down here, they're not going to be out in the ag fields. And then you get down along the Rio Grande River, and that's where you get some of the parks and tracks of the National Wildlife Refuge. So one of the things that I'm trying to work on now as part of the PhD program is trying to figure out what is greyhawk habitat here in the lower Rio Grande Valley. If you read the species account for greyhawks in Arizona, they like riparian areas with tall cottonwoods, and you hardly have any cottonwoods down here unless they are really old trees planted in someone's front yard. We do have some riparian areas along the river, but then you've got birds that are just all over in some of these urban areas. So I want to find out, what do they need to survive and reproduce? So way that I'm hoping to do that, I've got a lot of GPS locations, areas that I know that greyhawks are using. And then I want to match those up with a bunch of randomly selected locations that are going to be in an area that would be available to them. And then take GIS layers like this, where you get, what is the land cover there? What's the distance to water? How tall are the trees? Stack all those up and extract that information at all those locations and compare what's at these used locations to what was available to them, and hopefully figure out what they're selecting for. And then after doing that, if I identify some stuff that is suitable, what is suitable habitat, then do some more modeling, build a species distribution model, and identify other areas that have suitable habitat for greyhawks. And finally, a demographic study. I want to figure out, how's the population doing down here? Are they growing? Are they stable? Is it declining? What are survival rates for them? Reproductive rates? And trying to look and see if there are differences between survival rates between males and females, birds in urban versus natural areas. We're finding plenty of them in natural areas, but just because they're there and they're breeding there, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for them. It could be an ecological trap where they're attracted to it for some reason, but their survival is lower there than the birds in natural areas. So that is some of what I'm hoping to find out and what I'm working on now. So I think I went just a little bit short, but it's more time for questions. If y'all have them, happy to answer whatever. And then if you think of anything later, I've included my email addresses on here. So I've got my school email address at Texas A&M University-Kingsville, and also my personal email. Feel free to use whichever one.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. It was a great presentation, some exciting work you're doing, and obviously a lot of questions yet to be answered. So look forward to hopefully you getting some of the answers to those questions, and maybe another opportunity to report back to our constituents. Definitely have a few questions. It's curious, seeing all those satellite views and to some of the points you made about the lack of habitat, if there's any restoration work being done to increase the lost habitat, more than just holding on to what's left, or is there any possibility for that?
I am not aware of any restoration efforts in the valley right now. There's a lot of what exists down there are the tracks of the lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge. And that was years ago. I guess Fish and Wildlife had some money to spend, and someone got the idea to start buying up as many tracts of land as they could to conserve it. But even with those, I don't know of much management that's happening with those areas. They just bought them and have them, and trying to keep them as intact as possible. Some of those areas have lost some land recently with border wall construction, buffer zones, and the valley is a very rapidly growing area as well. So it's pretty urban in a lot of areas, and it's only going to get worse. It's projected to grow quite a bit. So it's an area that I think definitely needs a lot of focus, especially for grayhawks. And one of the things that I'm trying to tie into this to make anyone that reads my work aware of is that it is a very rapidly developing area, and the grayhawks that are in there, hopefully they're doing well. And hopefully it's something that can inform conservation work with other species. Mm-hmm. This is so a lot of the restoration work, hopefully agencies like Fish and Wildlife would step in and do some stuff at a federal level. Texas Parks and Wildlife could do some stuff at a state level. But there's a lot of good work that could happen at a county level, even city levels. And something I hope more and more people will realize is that individual landowners, with some of the places that these grayhawks are, they're nesting in old tall trees in people's front yards. And if they don't have trees that are tall enough, they're not going to nest there. So just people keeping some of the trees in their yards. There's one of these grayhawk territories in Mercedes, Texas, that I haven't done the math and figured it up, but I would say 3/4 of their territory they lost. It was a pretty good sized area, 2 different plots of land. The intact one, those owners haven't done anything with it. The other one, some people bought it. There was a house back there. They left the house. They cut down just about every single tree. So there's a lot that can be done, and unfortunately not much that I'm aware of.
Gotcha. So we have a few people asking about the type of prey they like to eat, which also kind of coincides with another question about, why their beak might have adapted to be larger than.
So the larger beak, my understanding, that's I think what most people think is that's because they eat a lot of lizards. That's one of the main prey items, which makes sense to me. They do eat a lot of stuff. There's a diet study in Arizona, and they've documented them eating all sorts of other things besides lizards, to include birds up to the size of quail. There's not a lot of research on grayhawks, though, and it's pretty much all from Arizona. So there's someone that just now started at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley this past fall, and that's something that he's wanting to work on, is grayhawk diet study, putting up some nest cameras and trying to get a good handle on what they are eating. I've had a homeowner send me a picture telling me that there's their grayhawks were eating a crow in their front yard, which we don't have down here. It turned out to be a great-tailed grackle. I've seen them get lizards. I've seen some kind of big fat dead toad that was left in a nest, and then we're able to trap them with balusha trees, with sparrows, mice, gerbils, so they're attracted to quite a bit. But as far as a lot of specifics in the valley, we don't know exactly, and hopefully this guy at UTRGV, Evan, will be finding that out.
Excellent. Another question, are there other southern hawk species that have similar migratory behavior in their first year, but then cease to migrate as adults?
There are not any that I'm aware of, and that's something I haven't dug into, though, either. So there might be some stuff out there that I just haven't looked at. There's a ton of stuff that I need to be reading that I'm not already, without adding to that list, but not that I'm aware of. We have white-tailed hawks down here. I know that their migration is not understood very well at all, and there's someone at Texas A&M in College Station that's putting transmitters on white-tailed hawks and trying to to wrap her head around what they're doing. But
interesting.
I know that migration, it's supposed to be pretty plastic with birds, with whether they can migrate or not. Some of the literature that I have read. So that would be my guess, is that the gene is there and it's pretty easy to turn off and on. And that might be what they're doing, but
so
it's another thing I'm hoping to understand a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. So given they're in these urban areas, what is their personality like? Do they tend to be, you mentioned they like to hold on to their territories. Obviously, they'll go after great horns and such. Do they tend to be aggressive towards people?
I have not talked to any people that have had them dive bombing them. Last July, I went over to Albuquerque and got to spend a few days with Brian Millsap. He's been working with urban Cooper's hawks in Albuquerque for, I think, probably at least 13 years. And there's people that would come and talk to us, and they won't go outside and go for a walk without taking an umbrella because of Cooper's hawks coming after them and making contact in some instances. I haven't heard of anything like that with the gray hawks. Some homeowners don't even know that they're there. Some people do. I think that they nest fairly high up in trees, and they can be very inconspicuous. So I don't think people have issues like that, but they do have different personalities. There's some territories that I can go drive up and park and get out of the car, and right away, if one of the adults is around, they'll be there alarming and carrying on. And there's some that you can look around for a while and then you realize that one's just sitting up in a tree watching you, not making a sound. So it's pretty varied. Like I said, they can also be very hard to find, very inconspicuous. Or I took someone from school down there yesterday to see him, and the first one we saw was perched on a power line along a very busy 55-mile-an-hour little road there. So
just a couple more, Mike. Thanks so far. Have you had any sightings of your banded birds in El Salvador? More or less, do you know the wintering habitats of where they went in El Salvador? I know you mentioned, I think the female was in a pretty urban area, I recall.
She was, and I don't remember the city. I mean, I know exactly where she was from the fixes, looking at it online. I don't remember the city. I haven't had any sightings outside of the U.S. except for one fairly recently. I'll look through iNaturalist quite a bit. I think you can make an observation on there without a photo, but for there's all these boxes to check for an observation to be research grade on iNaturalist, and one of those is being a photo. So just across the border in Mexico, I saw one of the color banded grayhawks, and I couldn't read the code on the color band. So I'm not sure exactly who it was. It wasn't very far across the border. I haven't seen any of them, though, from anywhere in Central America or anywhere farther south in Mexico. And hoping that one of these days I will. We've got a lot of bands out there, and I would be surprised if all the juveniles are staying here in South Texas and some of them aren't dispersing and breeding elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. When do they become able to breed?
So we have found some second-year birds paired with adults. They were all second-year females paired with adult males until last year. I found was able to capture and band a second-year male that was paired with an adult female. And they have been in a territory. They'll defend the territory. We hadn't found any of them breeding. Last year, I thought we were finally going to document the first second-year breeding because this female that they had a nest, she spent some time standing in the nest, sitting in the nest. We saw the pair copulate, but she never spent any time in there incubating and did not breed. So far we haven't documented any second year's breeding, but as a third year, last year I had 3 different third year females that were all birds that I banded as nestlings. that now are third-year females breeding, and some of their chicks have color bands and transmitters, which has been pretty neat.
Yeah, that is neat. Probably last question. It's kind of a multi-part. Curious what counties in South Texas you're now finding gray hawks, if there are any outside of the two you mentioned. You might mention those two again. And then kind of related to that, how far north can you or have you documented gray hawks? Texas.
Okay, so let me try and back up real quick. Whoops. Go farther. All right, so this is the one on the west is Hidalgo County, the one east is Cameron County, and there are a lot of birds in there. Right above Cameron, where's my cursor? So right up here, this is Willacy County. The first grayhawk that I caught in Bandit was up here in Willacy County, and that was right before we got the color band. So she got a USGS band, but no color band. It was a juvenile female. About a week later, I saw another juvenile up there when I was out birding with a friend, didn't have traps. And then I know that there's been at least one other up there that someone got a picture of and put in iNaturalist. I've tracked some that go up into Willacy County and then they turn around and come back. On the little inset map, it'll be sort of hard to see, but right up here, this is Corpus Christi. Just west of that is where I live in Alice. This summer, I had a bird, one of the juvenile females that came all the way up to Alice and was up here for about 2 hours before she turned around and went back. That's the farthest north that one has come. And it's just the juveniles that do this. The adults, even the floaters are staying around the other grayhawk territories down in the study area. So then going west, you've got Starr County on the west. That's got a lot of grayhawks. There's a lot of people that'll come to the valley and they'll go birding at Salineno, right on the river. Used to be a good spot for brown jays, but that's another good spot for grayhawks. People go there, look for them. They're in Starr County, and then they do go west all the way up by Laredo. Laredo has a birding festival. There's a golf course there that lets birders out there, and they go look for seed eaters and red-billed pigeons, some stuff like that. But there's a lot of grayhawks up in that area, so they go pretty far west. One thing that I'm not sure of going along the rivers, how far west do you have to go before they stop being resident and they start becoming migratory? Because once you get up here, the border goes up and then dips back down. That other dip, that's Big Bend National Park, and there's Big Bend Ranch State Park. So you get grayhawks nesting in Big Bend that are migratory, and then up in the Davis Mountains, you've got migratory grayhawks. So there's got to be a cutoff somewhere as you head up the river.
It's interesting you mentioned Laredo. That was the last part of this question, dealt with, addressing the grayhawk population in the Laredo area.
They're up there. I really haven't even paid attention to eBird sightings too much to see. That'd be a pretty easy way to see if they're there in the winter or not. Whether they're territorial or not, I'm not sure. They're observing birds in Arizona in the winter. I think that's happening more frequently. I know this winter someone observed a pair of grayhawks together. And the last thing I heard is that they're seeing them in Arizona, but they're not territorial in the winter. And if they found a pair there in the winter, I would be amazed if that pair is not in a territory and defending it. I would be very surprised, but there's no telling. But Laredo, there's a lot there. I'm not sure what they're doing. I've definitely got my hands full trying to figure out what they're doing down here.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, hey, thank you so much, Mike. I think we'll end with the questions there. Appreciate the level of engagement from everybody on the line. And just once again, thank you, Mike, so much for a great presentation.